It's no surprise that fierce and passionate battles around the world over the centuries have left strong imprints on the landscape. The name for this phenomenon is called stone tape theory, that speculates that ghosts and hauntings are analogous to tape recordings, and that mental impressions during emotional or traumatic events can be projected in the form of energy, recorded onto rocks, the surrounding landscape and the environments, and replayed under certain conditions. The following event could very well be a classic stone tape theory, where a ghost army was regularly witnessed by many people. Suter Fell is in the English Lake District and stands to the south of Mungersdale village in the Northern Fells, and is famous for the appearance of a spectral army. The first possible witness to the ghost army took place in 1735, when a servant under the employment of William Lancaster of Blake Hills. He was about a half mile from Suter Fell and saw the east side of the mountain covered with regular marching army for over an hour. The ghost army appeared to come from the north end and marched over a niche in the top, but as there were no other witnesses to the strange event, he was discredited and laughed at. 2 years later, in 1737, on Midsummer Eve between 8 p.m. and 9 p.m, the servant's employer, William Lancaster himself, witnessed several gentlemen following their horses. Believing that the men were returning from a hunt, he initially chose to ignore them. Then about 10 minutes later, he again turned his head around, where the men appeared to be mounted alongside with a vast army. The army were in the same place where 2 years previously his servant had witnessed them, but was ridiculed and not believed. William Lancaster then called his family over, who also witnessed the strange event, and observed that one of the soldiers who quit the ranks seemed to stand in a fronting posture, as if he were regulating the order of their march and counting the numbers. After a while, he returned full gallop to the station he had left. The army then continued to march as long as there was light to see them. The next account of a ghostly army took place about 8 years later, where spectral soldiers were seen marching along on Midsummer's Day in 1745. On the evening of Midsummer's Day in that year, a line of marching troops, cavalry and carriages were seen travelling along the summit ridge of Suter Fell. The ground over which they moved should have been too steep for such transport, but the procession continued to march for at least 2.5 hours until night fell, constantly appearing at one end of the ridge and disappearing at the other. It is claimed that the spectral army was witnessed by 26 people who'd viewed the proceedings and would later testify on oath to a magistrate of what they'd seen. The following day, some climbers walked up the Suter Fell in search of evidence that the phantom army had really marched. But when they reached the soft ground of the ridge, found that there was no sign whatsoever that soldiers had been marching, as there were no footprints anywhere. So what were the eyewitnesses actually looking at? Because if it was only 1 or 2 people, it could easily have been dismissed, but the number of eyewitnesses was extremely high. Researchers then went in search of possible links with the folklore of the region. Suter is a large mount in Cumbria, United Kingdom, and is situated about 40 miles from the Scottish border. 26 people had witnessed a series of horsemen marching across the top of the mount at a place which would normally have been impossible for cavalry to access. 2 years later, in 1747, a writer visited the area and spoke to several witnesses who alleged that the incident that had taken place in 1745 was not the only occasion the spectral army had been seen, as there had been other spectral sightings on the mountainside. Another eyewitness account was written by a man called James Clark, who grew up in the area and knew it well. In 1789, he wrote about the incident in a book called A Survey of the Lakes of Cumberland, Westmoreland and Lancashire. So what was the spectral army, and who were they? Over the years, there have been many Jacobite rebellions between 1688 and the last Jacobite rebellion in 1745, and each battle may have left a powerful imprint on the landscape, leading to any number of spectral armies. The following famous case of a residual haunting, or classic stone tape theory, took place after a major battle during the English Civil War. The Battle of Edgehill was the first major conflict of the English Civil War from 1642 to 1651, and took place on the fields of Warwickshire between Warwick and Banbury in the West Midlands region of England. The Battle of Edgehill took place on the 23rd of October 1642 after constitutional disagreement between the government and King Charles I, where the king finally raised his standard and led his troops against the parliamentary army, who were also called Roundheads. almost 30,000 soldiers clashed in a bloody battle where both armies suffered heavy losses during the 3 hours of fighting. Corpses which littered the fields were thrown into mass graves. However, this was not to be the last of the Battle of Edgehill, and shortly before Christmas 1642, and after the armies had left the battlefield, the villages continued to be haunted by spectres and apparitions. On Christmas Day between 12 o'clock and 1 o'clock in the morning, shepherds could hear the sound of drums in the distance, along with the screaming and yelling of soldiers and the cries of the dying. They could only stand in amazement as the sounds appeared to get closer and closer, where they quickly ran away fearing for their lives. The shepherds had not gone far when a huge vision appeared to fill the sky with strange apparitions of two armies. They could hear the clattering of arms and the noise of cannon fire. They saw flags along with the sound of beating drums and musket fire, horses neighing and the cries of the soldiers. They were now witnessing a full-on battle, and in the bloodshed in front of the shepherds, the king's forces seemed to have the advantage, but were later overcome by the parliamentarians, where the king's army was eventually routed. The shepherds were terrified and could not believe what they were seeing, and were too scared to stay, but too afraid to run for fear of being caught up in the battle. They could only stay and witness the horrors that were taking place in front of them. The battle left a haunting that filled both earth and sky. The poor shepherds had to endure 3 long hours of watching the frightening scenes that would eventually vanish in the night sky. The apparition had lasted many hours and then disappeared by dawn. The shepherds then made their way to the village of Kinnerton, which was just over 8 kilometres away from the battlefield in Edgehill. On reaching the village, they went directly to the Justice of Peace, Mr. Wood, and his neighbour, Mr. Marshall, who was the local priest. They then gave an account of the whole battle and swore an oath that it was all true. Normally, any person that had come forward to the authorities claiming to have witnessed a spectral army and the ensuing battle would have been considered either mad or drunk, but many of the men were considered honest men with strong moral principles. Word soon spread, and the following night, many villagers made their way to the Edgehill battleground, where they too were witness to the same horrific battle scene as the two armies fought each other in the same bloody battle. They were so terrified by what they had just witnessed that they quickly made their way home, asking God to defend them from the hell they had just witnessed. Then nothing happened for 5 nights, until the battle repeated on the following Saturday and Sunday nights with even greater ferocity. It repeated thereafter every weekend. News of the ghostly spectres eventually reached King Charles himself, who at the time was based in Oxford, approximately 48 kilometres away. King Charles then sent a royal commission of 6 officers to report on the sightings. The officers included Colonel Lewis Kirk, Captain Dudley, Captain Wayman, and 3 other gentlemen of high standing, who were sent to help calm the people of Kinnerton and to witness the apparitions for themselves. When the 6 officers visited the battlefield, the officers and a couple who had actually fought at the battle themselves confirmed the apparitions and even identified some of the soldiers. They saw Sir Edmund Verney, the king's standard-bearer. In the battle, the standard-bearer acted as an indicator of where the position of a military unit was. They had a bright carnival flag that would act as a strong visual beacon to surrounding soldiers. When captured during the battle, Sir Edmund had refused to give up the standard. To take the standard from him, his hand was cut off. The Royalists subsequently recaptured the standard, where it was claimed that Sir Edmund's hand was still attached. After their ordeal, the 6 officers made a report titled "A Great Wonder in Heaven," describing the late apparitions, along with the noises of the war and battle seen at Edgehill. The report was published on 23rd of January 1643, and the Edgehill spectres are the only ghosts to be officially recognised by the British Public Record Office. The British Public Record Office was the guardian of the National Archives of Great Britain. Unfortunately, there were still many bodies that had not been placed into graves, and continued to litter the battlefield. The locals of nearby villages retrieved the bodies and gave them a Christian burial, in the hope that the soul would find peace. It is claimed that after the burials, the apparitions ceased. However, that was not to be, and since then, many people have reported hearing cannon fire, battle cries, and horses' hooves echoing over the Edgehill battlefield, especially around the anniversary of the event. Witnesses believe that it was caused by the restless spirits of the slain soldiers who were buried in a graveyard near the battlefield. Some modern-day visitors to the cemetery said that the place has a disturbed feel to it, and there appears to be no doubt that the horrific battle had left a strong residual impression in the surrounding environment, and appears to repeat itself over and over again for almost 400 years. If you're enjoying this video, don't forget to hit like. It really helps to keep the channel growing. And if you're new here, subscribe and tap the bell icon so you never miss our latest videos. We've got lots of strange and fascinating stories coming up, and we'd love to have you along for the journey. The town of Gettysburg in Pennsylvania is one of the most haunted locations in the United States. Over 3 days, ending on July 3rd, 1863, intense fighting at a key point in the American Civil War cost the lives of more than 7,800 courageous Union and Confederate soldiers. Tens of thousands more were injured and maimed. It's little surprise that a multitude of paranormal experiences have been reported at the Gettysburg National Military Park. Sightseers and psychic investigators have photographed strange images, recorded eerie phenomena, and filmed mystifying ghost videos there. Here are 6 of the most haunted places in Gettysburg. Number 6. The Farnsworth House Inn. Built in 1810, this solid brick house is known as one of the most haunted inns in America. It was used by both Union and Confederate soldiers at different times, and is said to accommodate many Civil War era spirits. Both staff and guests regularly experience creepy phenomena. Hotel guests have sensed their beds shaking or jolting in the dark of the night, like someone abruptly sitting on them. Some have reported disembodied footsteps, unexplained slamming doors, and seeing shadowy figures walking throughout the inn. 2 waitresses have had their apron strings yanked and then turned around full circle. When all is very quiet, a jaw harp solo can be heard from the empty attic, where a ghost soldier is still on duty. Number 5. Little Round Top. During the 1993 filming of the powerful movie named Gettysburg, much of the action took place on location at the original battlefields. Because so many extras were required to portray soldiers, the film company hired reenactors for many Union and Confederate Army roles. During a rest period one day, some of the extras were located at Little Round Top, a rocky hillside on the battlefield. As they watched the sunset, a bedraggled old man approached them, talking of the horrors of the skirmish and handing out rounds of ammunition. The crew members described him as wearing a burnt and disheveled Union uniform and reeking of sulphurous gunpowder. As the man then walked away, the extras looked closely at the ammunition he had given them. They had assumed that the old man was part of the film production. However, on speaking to the props manager, they were astonished to hear that the ammunition had not come from him. The objects, passed on by the feisty old soldier, were later found to be real musket rounds from the time of the Civil War. Number 4. Devil's Den. Dozens of spirit encounters have been reported by sightseers at Devil's Den, a large reach strewn with boulders on the old Gettysburg battlefield. The ghost most often sighted in this paranormal hotspot is that of a disheveled man, barefoot and wearing a tan shirt and floppy hat, which suggests he was from a unit of Texan soldiers who fought in the battle. All who have met this spirit report that he approaches and always says in a helpful manner the same thing: "What you're looking for is over there," while pointing towards the Plum Run stream. He then vanishes from sight. Number 3. The Phantom Hospital. Mark Nesbitt is a prominent researcher and author on the ghosts of Gettysburg, and has documented one of the location's most horrifying sightings. During the Battle of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania Hall at Gettysburg College was used as a field hospital for treating the wounded from the battlefield. While it has been the site of many Civil War era paranormal sightings, none was powerful as on one particular night, 2 college administrators had caught the elevator from the 4th floor down to the 1st, and were puzzled when it bypassed the 1st floor and proceeded to the basement. When the elevator doors opened, the administrators were shocked to see that what was storage space had been replaced by a silent but frantic scene from the improvised hospital. Blood-soaked doctors and orderlies were hastening around the room in a panic, in desperate efforts to save the horrifically injured men lying on the floor amongst the remains of others who had passed. While no sound came from the hideous apparition, both administrators saw it all too clearly. Terrified, they forcefully pushed the elevator button to close the doors. Both later reported that as the doors closed, one of the orderlies looked up and stared straight at them, seeming to see them, with a pleading look as if imploring them to help. Number 2. Sacks-covered bridge. Sacks-covered bridge was constructed in 1854, spanning 100 feet across Marsh Creek, and in close proximity to the battlefield. Many strange phenomena have been reported there, particularly between the hours of midnight and 4 a.m. Many tourists to the bridge have claimed to witness full-bodied apparitions of soldiers, heard ghostly voices, and felt eerie sensations of touching and hair-pulling. Local legend has it that 3 Confederate soldiers were hanged from the bridge, some say for deserting, while another story has it they were spies. A group of paranormal researchers investigating the location reported an eerie fog filling the air and seeing strange lights from across the marsh. They heard frightening sounds of neighing horses and cannon blasts for over 20 minutes, and with the final cannon shot, the fog suddenly disappeared. A group that returned to the site later that night reported even more terrifying experiences of shadow people darting around them. Disembodied men shouted, and inexplicable growling and loud battle sounds. Number 1. The battlefield. Probably the most unsettling encounters experienced at Gettysburg are the audio sensations, whether heard in person by ear or electronic voice recording, that seem to frequently emerge. Visitors regularly report hearing battle cries and calls to charge, followed by the agonized screaming and moaning of the wounded and dying men. The ghostly cries of pain and suffering can completely surround you with a frightening echo effect. Given that these spiritual phenomena often persist in places of intense human adversity and emotion, it is understandable that Gettysburg ghosts are so prevalent at the actual scenes of the conflict. Battles and conflicts throughout history sometimes leave more than destruction, along with broken bodies and broken minds. The following 3 stories are about battles that left their impression throughout history, where over many years, frightened and dismayed witnesses saw them replayed again and again. The Cavalier. The following story happened in 1978, when Nigel Sweet was attending Malvern College in Malvern, Worcestershire, UK. At the time, Mr. Sweet was 13 years old and was a student at the boarding school, and what he witnessed frightened him so much that the ghostly scenario remains with him to this day. His story begins at 8 p.m. in the evening, where it was a clear and cold night. At the time, they were walking back into the main building to have their nightly bath. Just as it got out of the bath and was drying himself, one of the students yelled out, "Hey, there's someone on our cricket pitch." The cricket pitch was situated on the far side of the main sports field. Another student said, "Let's go and see who it is." 3 students, including Nigel, who was reluctant, then left the main building in search of the intruder. They had a small torch and slowly made their way to the location. As they approached the site, they came upon something that left all the boys paralysed with fear. They saw a man kneeling beside a white horse, and his head was bowed and in his hands. His shape seemed to shimmer an eerie gold colour, and he was dressed in clothing that looked like he was a cavalier from the English Civil War. The boys were just a few metres from the figure, and for what appeared to be a few minutes, just gazed at the spectral image. They then slowly drew closer to the figure, where he suddenly turned his head and glared at them. All the boys immediately ran away, but Nigel was glued to the spot, just staring. The man's eyes were sad, and then a smile appeared on his face. Then he bent down and picked up his wide-brimmed hat, placed it on his head, and walked away, while his horse followed behind him. The cavalier had only walked a few steps, then suddenly vanished. Nigel then walked over to where the man and the horse had been standing, looking for signs such as hoof marks, or anything that showed a man had been standing on that spot, but there was nothing. He never saw the figure again. On further research, he found that on the site where the school grounds now stood, there'd been several confrontations between Oliver Cromwell's soldiers and the King's army during the English Civil War in the mid-17th century. It appears that the Cavalier had probably lost his life on the very spot where the cricket pitch now stood. But it could not have been a residual haunting, because the Cavalier had noticed the boys, so he was either a ghost or they'd been caught in a time slip. The Tower. The following incident happened in 1951 at Kerniggar Hill, Dunster, in Somerset, southwest England. Joyce Nichols and Francis Robinson were on holiday in Dunster and decided to climb up the hill, which was quite steep. At the top of the hill was a tower that was built around 1760, and they decided to climb the tower. When they'd first started walking, the day was warm and sunny, but the moment they reached the top of the tower, the atmosphere completely changed, where it became cold and dark, as if they'd suddenly been plunged back into winter. The silence was then shattered by what appeared to be the sound of soldiers marching towards them. The strangest thing was that they could hear the army marching but could not see them. It suddenly dawned on them that they were quite possibly hearing a ghost army approaching, yet this army was approaching them while they were at the top of the tower and were coming straight at them. As the army drew closer and closer, they panicked and in a mad rush ran from the tower, injuring themselves in the process as they were fleeing. Joyce and Francis never did find out who the army could have been, but 20 miles away there'd been a major battle during the English Civil War called the Battle of Sedgemoor that took place on the 5th of July 1685. Since that date, people claim to have heard the sounds of a battle as if it was being reenacted. There have also been ghost sightings of tired and defeated soldiers. Dunster Castle was occupied by both sides during the English Civil War, where it appears that the sounds of war had reached the tower, terrifying Joyce Nichols and Francis Robinson. The Spectral Highlanders. In November 1956, in the Quillan Hills south of the island of Skye in Scotland, two Oxford geology students, Peter Zinofiev and Patrick Skipwich, were camping. At about 3 o'clock in the morning, Peter was awoken by some strange noises and peeped out of the tent to see where the noises were coming from. To his utter amazement, he observed a large number of kilted Highlanders charging across the open ground. He quickly awoke Patrick, who verified the army of kilted soldiers, and both were terrified at what they were seeing. The following day, they moved their tent further up the hill and deliberately stayed awake to try and capture an enactment of the spectral army that they'd seen the previous night, but nothing happened and they went to sleep. However, at 4 a.m, they were awakened by the same sounds of the previous night, and as they looked out of their tent, they saw the Scottish Highlanders stumbling across the mountainside, as if in retreat, as they were totally bedraggled and half dead. The following morning, they approached a man called Ian Campbell at the Slegargan Hotel on the coast near Loch Slegargan. He said to the young men that they were not the first to experience such strange happenings and believed that what they'd witnessed were ghost soldiers or residual hauntings from either the 13th century or most likely soldiers from the 1745 Jacobite Rebellion. The rebellion was led by Bonnie Prince Charlie to restore the Stuarts to the Scottish throne. But unfortunately, he lost the battle and was forced to escape over the sea to Skye, where the famous 19th century Scottish song was written. Reverend Joseph Olwen Roberts was a writer, broadcaster and a former vicar of Lalenghi Parish near Bangor in Wales. He wrote several books on religion and the paranormal. He was also a broadcaster and expert on the supernatural, and especially his experience of ghosts. In 2018, he died at Bangor, Wales at the age of 99. The following are two fascinating paranormal stories that he'd covered in his time as a vicar and ghostbuster. The plane crash. The following incident happened to a woman called Elizabeth Pritchard when, during an out-of-body experience, observed a plane crash that her son had been involved in. It was World War II, and Elizabeth Pritchard's only son, Hefin, was sent to Canada by the Royal Air Force. Elizabeth and her husband William ran a general store and post office in Bangor, Gwynedd, northwest Wales. And one November night, she sat up in bed extremely agitated and woke up her husband and told him that their son Hefin had been in an awful accident and was afraid he was dead. Her husband believed she'd just had a terrible dream and tried to calm her, but she insisted she had seen their son's plane crash with her own eyes. She described it as if she were at the scene of the accident and could hear him shout "Mum, Mum" in her sleep. In her vivid dream, there was a powerful blizzard, and Elizabeth said she could not even see her hands in front of her face. She could hear the sound of a bomber plane, and then saw the shape of the plane flying very low, and through the blizzard she could just make out the black shape of a plane crashing into a mountain. She then saw the nose of the plane buried in the snow, and waited to see if any of the airmen emerged from the wreckage, and could see smoke come from under the left wing. Elizabeth waited and waited, but nothing happened. It was now very quiet, and it stopped snowing, and Elizabeth decided to approach the plane and went inside and saw 5 men who appeared to be dead. They were lying on the floor, face down. She then saw a man at the back of the plane who had also passed. She then saw her son Hafen lying on the floor of the plane, face down, and could see that it hit his head, and there was a lot of blood, and his leg was twisted right around, as if it didn't belong to him. Her husband insisted that she must have been dreaming, but Elizabeth could not be consoled. Her son regularly sent letters, but for some reason they'd stopped coming, which further added to Elizabeth's belief that something serious had happened to him, and waited desperately for a letter to arrive. It would be 3 weeks until a letter would finally arrive, which indicated to Elizabeth that maybe it really was just a dream. In the letter, her son said it had been temporarily moved from flying duties and had been transferred to another base in Canada. The move meant that any leave that was due had been postponed, and it would be 6 months before he could come home. Fortunately, time passed quickly, and the day came that they were ready to pick up their son from Bangor Station after returning from Canada. As the train door opened, they could see their son waving at them with an airman's kit bag thrown onto their platform, and then saw their son leaning heavily on a crutch. When they arrived home, his father pointed to the wounds and asked him what had happened. He then told his father what his mother already knew, that he had been flying on a training trip over Alaska with 5 other men on the plane and got caught up in a terrible blizzard. They'd been flying low in order to get a bearing and then crashed into a mountain where his leg had been smashed and 4 others in the plane had died. Luckily, another plane had been flying close behind, and the pilot had been able to give it accurate position readings when it flew back to base, and rescue planes had reached them fairly quickly, where he was unfortunately the only survivor. He later found that 4 of the crew had been killed on impact, and he himself was unconscious when they found him, and he was bleeding badly from a head wound and a shattered leg. His father asked him when the accident took place, but at this point his mother interjected with the accurate information that it happened at 1 a.m. in the morning of Thursday the 17th November the previous year. Everything their son had described to his mother was seen in accurate detail because she'd either had an out-of-body experience or her physical body had somehow been projected. Either way, she had seen everything that her son had described. However, what would have happened if her son had regained consciousness in the plane whilst his mother was viewing the accident? Would he have seen her ghostly apparition, or would she have appeared as a solid human being? The haunted couple. One night, a young couple by the name of Peter and Zoe were suddenly awoken when their blankets were being slowly pulled from the bed, exposing them to a freezing December night. Peter then opened his eyes, and about 1 foot from his startled face was the leering head of a ghost. The apparition looked to be that of a middle-aged woman, which then stepped back from the bed and stood by the door, pointing an accusing finger at him. Peter tried to scream, but no sound came out of his mouth. He was frozen in fear. Zoe then gave a piercing shriek before leaping out of bed and racing into the night, with Peter following close behind. The terrified couple immediately called on the Reverend Alwyn Roberts, who was known in the district as the Holy Ghostbuster, along with his assistant medium Elwyn Roberts. The couple told them that before the ghost had appeared, they'd been hearing mysterious scratching on the floorboards under the bed. The 2 Ghostbusters and the young couple then went back to their freezing house in the Welsh Hills in the middle of the night and lit the stove as they waited for the ghost to reappear. The medium Elwyn suddenly said, "She's here all right, she's standing by the kitchen door," not sure whether to come further or not. She then asked the Reverend to talk to her. The Reverend was quite fearless, had experienced many ghosts in his lifetime, and said, "Come along, come nearer to us. We have come to your house to help you. Tell us if something is troubling you." The medium was able to communicate with the spirit and found that her name was Hannah Roberts. In order to find the period of time in which she had lived, Reverend Roberts asked, "What was the name of your minister?" "Minister?" spat the ghost, speaking through the medium. "That man is a minister of the devil, sending all our young men to the trenches to be killed." Reverend Roberts knew immediately that she meant preacher John Williams, who had become a recruiting officer in Anglesey, Wales, and had sent many men off to die in the First World War. Then his spirit said, "Why don't these people help me find the deeds of the farm? The papers William hid before he went off to war," she demanded. Then she disappeared, leaving the young couple very shaken as they realised the scraping they'd heard under the bed had been the ghost of Hannah Roberts searching for the missing farmhouse deeds. The couple then put the kettle on, and as they settled down to a cup of tea, Zoe suddenly froze in fear, a finger pointing at the kitchen door. There, she said. Reverend Roberts then looked around and could see the faint outline of a woman. She was a little woman, about 60, with short grey hair and the ruddy cheeks of an outdoor person. They found that the ghost was not nasty or vindictive, but turned out to be a nice, homely lady and was actually enjoying herself. She couldn't resist the chance to shock people and take centre stage. Reverend Roberts later confirmed that Hannah Roberts had lived at the farm until her husband William was killed in the Battle of Ypres in Belgium in World War I, and she'd been moved out because she could not find the deeds. Afterwards, Peter and Zoe rang Reverend Roberts to tell him that their ghostly visitor Hannah is still with them, and they did not want to get rid of her anymore. Now that we have seen her, we found she was a lovely old lady. We really don't mind. In fact, the couple would later hold regular ghost parties in the house, where they enjoyed sitting in the dark with their friends, and whenever Peter called out to the spirit, Hannah would knock twice on the table.
Originally founded by Roman Catholic missionaries as the Mission San Antonio de Valero, the Alamo was initially established for the education of converted Native American residents in the mid-1700s. Secularized in 1793, then abandoned, the mission became a base for various causes, including revolutionaries and rebels. The Alamo site was then developed as a fortress which came under attack in 1836 from self-proclaimed Mexican dictator General Santa Anna. After a 13-day battle with rebellious Texans, the Mexicans prevailed, but with massive casualties to both sides. Today, the Alamo is a famous historic monument and one of the most haunted locations in the US. Reports of apparitions at the old mission have emerged for almost 2 centuries. Before the Battle of the Alamo, most land in what is now Alamo Plaza was used as a cemetery between 1724 and 1793, housing about 1,000 souls, which were added to by most of the slain soldiers from both sides of the battle. Still today, local workers often uncover skulls and other remains when excavating in the area. The sightings of ghostly activity began only weeks after the Battle of the Alamo. When General Santa Anna left San Antonio, he stationed about 1,000 men there to control uprisings. However, when the general himself was captured at San Jacinto by Texican freedom fighters in April 1836, he sent messages to order the complete destruction of the Alamo in retaliation. Astonishingly, as the Mexican troops approached the church with flaming torches, 6 fully formed spirits suddenly materialized at the front doors of the mission, brandishing fiery sabers and shouting, "Do not touch the Alamo, do not touch these walls." The terrified Mexicans retreated and refused to return despite threats from their superiors. The beings were thought to be Alamo defenders or monks safeguarding their mission. Colonel Sanchez, who had led the group, described 6 diablos or devils emerging from the front doors. His replacement gathered another group of men to charge the Alamo, but was reportedly confronted by a tall male spirit rising from the roof of the building, towering over the Mexican soldiers and holding 2 flaming balls of fire in his outstretched hands. On witnessing the terrifying spectre, the soldiers dropped to their knees and covered their eyes. Again retreating, the Mexicans vowed never to return, and for the following 10 years, the Alamo lay abandoned. Until 1846, when, after Texas annexation into the United States, the US Army moved into and repaired the old fortress. Reports of ghostly occurrences at the Alamo persisted into the late 19th century. The city of San Antonio began to use the old mission and barracks as a police headquarters and jail, and soon prisoners housed there began to complain of paranormal disturbances. Between 1894 and 1897, the San Antonio Express-News reported sightings of ghostly sentries pacing along the police station roof and strange behaviours. Moaning sounds were heard by the staff and prisoners, while guards and watchmen refused to man the building after hours because of bizarre occurrences. Amidst political uproar, the prisoners were soon moved to another location. Today, apparitions continue to be seen at all hours of the day and night. Guests at nearby hotels report grotesque apparitions emerging from the wall of the old Alamo and seemingly restless spirits pacing to and fro on top of the buildings. Others have heard the sounds of screaming, explosions, and the subdued trumpet rendition of El Degüello, the Spanish call of no quarter that Santa Anna instructed to be played during the final attack on the fort. Several federal marshals who have guarded the grounds at night have resigned their jobs after encountering wandering entities within the former cemetery. One is the fully formed spirit of a cowboy wearing a full-length black coat and cowboy hat. Always soaked, he is described as appearing to have ridden through a massive thunderstorm. Some Texas historians identify the spirit as one of 22 dispatch riders that Texan soldier William Travis dispatched to seek assistance. Another strange presence is that of an Alamo defender who is regularly seen sticking his head and shoulders out of the large rectangular window above the double doors at the entry to the church. After leaning out and scoping the area, he then moves back and disappears. A frequently sighted ghost is that of a small blonde-haired boy, usually seen in the left upstairs window of what is now the gift shop. The forlorn-looking boy usually appears during the first few weeks of February and has also been spotted wandering the grounds. Some speculate that the boy was evacuated during the siege and returns every year to seek his long-lost father, who was probably slain in the battle. A woman is sometimes seen next to the water well beside the church. The airy torso-shaped spirit appears only at night and has not been identified. Staff often admit to being afraid to enter the basement, where a tall Native American has silently crept up behind them. After sensing a presence, they turn to see the broad-chested man who suddenly vanishes or walks back through a solid wall that once housed a tunnel doorway to the Menga Hotel across the street. Another presence is that of a tall, stately Mexican officer who slowly wanders the grounds and buildings, his face filled with sorrow. He walks with his arms clasped behind his back while slowly shaking his head. Many believe him to be the spirit of General Manuel Fernandez de Castrillon, one of Santa Anna's regimental commanders and one of the few officers opposing the final assault on the Alamo, predicting the massacre it turned out to be. The transparent form of frontiersman and Alamo defender Davy Crockett has also been observed by park rangers at the site. Wearing buckskin clothing and coonskin cap, and carrying a flintlock rifle, he is described as standing to attention in different places around the Alamo. Every March, a few days after the final come-down of the Alamo, many locals report being woken in the early hours by the sound of a horse galloping on the footpath. The unseen rider is thought to be James Allen, who was the last courier sent from the Alamo on the evening before its last battle. His restless wandering is believed to reflect his ceaseless attempts to return to the Alamo with his report to Colonel Travis. Also often seen are a tall, thin man and a small child on the roof of the Alamo mission at dawn. Towards the end of the siege, several Mexican officers reported that they were horrified as they watched a man, carrying a small child in his arms, leap to the ground at the back of the Alamo church. 2 other young boys are also spotted following tour groups in the complex. The lads just seem to materialise behind a group, then just as suddenly vanish when it reaches the sacristy room. They are thought to be the 9 and 12-year-old sons of Alamo artilleryman Anthony Wolfe. The boys hid in the Alamo mission, but were mistaken for Alamo defenders and slain by the advancing Mexicans. A surprising addition to the historical figures is the ghost of actor John Wayne. In 1960, when the Duke directed and acted in the film The Alamo, he became engrossed in its history. Wanting historical accuracy, He personally explored the Alamo several times and checked the actual blueprints of the fortress before outlaying about $1.5 million to recreate an exact replica of the old mission in Brackettville, Texas. Shortly after his passing, staff and visitors started to report sightings of Wayne strolling the grounds of the original Alamo, sometimes even talking with the spirits of the Alamo defenders. 2 places where the bodies of soldiers were buried are also said to be haunted. A bookstore located beneath a Riverwalk bridge reportedly experiences paranormal activity, with one corner of the store always very cold and books often mysteriously flying off the shelves. The deceased Mexican soldiers were placed in a spot that today is a children's park, which is also extremely haunted. At the Alamo Plaza, many sightings have been made of a spectral woman walking across the plaza. She is believed to be one of 2 women who were struck by lightning inside the mission grounds in the 1700s. One of the women survived, but she is thought to be the one who did not. There have been multiple reports of a lone man dressed in early 19th century clothing, often seen walking along the highway outside of town. He carries a long rifle, and when passers-by stop to assist, the man replies that he is needing to get back to the Alamo where he belongs. Many believe that this lonely spirit is that of Louis M. Rose, the Alamo's only coward. Rose was the only man who resisted joining the defenders and instead fled the scene. Regretting his escape, he now seems riddled with guilt and trying over and over again to reclaim his honour by returning to the battle. A wide array of extreme hauntings seems to occur in the Alamo, as reported by tourists, rangers and staff. Nearly every storefront building on the Alamo Plaza, which faces the church, is haunted, and throughout are phenomena like grotesque human-shaped forms emerging from the walls, screams of those fighting in the battle, disembodied voices and whispers filtering from the walls, eerie cold spots, vanishing lights, and the feeling of being watched by invisible eyes.
Spirit possession is the control of a human body by another spirit, and that belief exists in many religions. Whether possession may be voluntary or involuntary and may be considered to have beneficial or detrimental effects on the host. The following amazing incident involved spirit possession that took place shortly after World War II, which involved 2 brothers, Jimmy and Bill Caulfield, who flew planes during World War II. World War II had been raging for almost 2 years when in July 1941, 17-year-old Bill Caulfield was at home with his older brother Jimmy, who was 24 years old and on leave from the RAF. Bill considered his older brother a war hero who flew regular missions with the RAF and could not wait to emulate his brother, and told him that he too wanted to be a pilot like him with the RAF. His brother Jimmy was well aware of the danger and high fatality rate of pilots during the war and tried to deter his brother from joining the RAF by telling him that would not suit his temperament, and if he was determined to join up, he should work in the office, where it was much safer rather than up in the air. On the 12th of August, and one day before his 25th birthday, Jimmy was flying a Bristol Blenheim, which was used extensively in the first 2 years of the war. His mission was to do a low-level raid across the North Sea and then fly over Holland into Germany. Their orders were to bomb 2 factories outside of Cologne. The whole event was meant to be a surprise daylight attack that Stalin had asked Churchill to carry out so as to halt Germany's march into Russia. Jimmy and his fellow crewmen successfully completed their bombing mission, but daylight raids were exceptionally risky, and as they were returning to base, their plane was hit both by ground artillery and German air fighters. All in all, 12 Bristol Blenheims were shot down, including Jimmy Caulfield's plane. Jimmy's body was found 2 weeks later, washed up at the northern end of Texel Island, a short distance from the Dutch coast, which was a common location that many airmen fighting for Britain that were unfortunately shot down were washed up. Although Bill Caulfield was extremely upset at the loss of his brother, it would not be the last time they would communicate with him. Not to be deterred by his brother's warnings about flying, if anything, it spurred him on in his determination to become a pilot. Bill joined the RAF and was posted No. 28 Elementary Training School at Wolverhampton in the West Midlands in central England, and true to his word, would go on to obtain his wings. He was then posted to the operational training unit where he too would participate in the theatre of war, just like his brother, where he flew Wellington bombers and Lancaster bombers and achieved his ambition of becoming a pilot. Unlike Jimmy, Bill was fortunate enough to survive the war and continued to make flying his career, where he went to the Transport Command to fly Dakotas and qualified for a civilian pilot's license which would enable him to fly passenger airlines. But Bill decided to remain with the RAF and was posted to No. 1 Ferry Unit at Pershore, Worcestershire in the West Midlands, England. It was on his next tour of duty at Pershore where Bill would again meet up with his deceased brother. It was on the 12th of January 1947 that Bill had to fly an Avro Anson 19 twin-engine plane to Singapore, stopping first in Paris and then to Italy. After Italy, the next stop would be Athens, and because the plane he was flying was only a small aircraft, it was important to check his fuel against any inclement weather. Initially, they were advised that the weather conditions would be safe and continued their journey up to the point of no return. This was a point where you needed the same amount of fuel to either continue your journey or go back. Unfortunately for Bill and his crew, they had extreme weather conditions where they ran into a severe thunderstorm. The storm forced Bill's plane down to 50 feet above sea level because to have taken his plane higher would have risked the plane breaking up due to buffeting storm clouds. Bill and his crew were now in mortal danger, surrounded by black skies and severe weather conditions, and would have been dangerously low on fuel. Because they had zero visibility, that overshot their proposed landing site on an island in the Ionian Sea off the Greek coast. But then, simultaneously, all 3 crew members spotted the coastline, but it was unsuitable for landing, as it was rocky and would have been extremely dangerous to attempt a landing. If Bill was unable to locate a safe beach, he would have had no other option but to land on the sea, which would surely have meant their certain demise or serious injury. Then a navigator announced that he had spotted the Corinth Canal, where Bill had an instinctive feeling that he needed to steer the plane to the canal's opening. It was whilst flying inside the canal that all 3 crew members experienced a sense of peace and silence that appeared to surround the plane. One of the crew said it felt like they were all inside a quiet cathedral. It was at this stage that Bill, without any doubt, felt the presence of his brother Jimmy in the plane. He said it felt as normal as actually talking to him. Although he could not see him physically, he was certain he was with him. Bill was now feeling a sense of high emotion and could only put the intense feeling down to the fact that he was in extreme danger. But what happened next took the incident to another level, where Bill then relaxed his hands and allowed his brother to take over the controls. Bill would later compare the feeling to sensitives and mediums who allow spirits to take over their bodies in automatic writing or seances. Now under his brother's control, the plane flew 4 miles down the Corinth Canal in the dark until they safely arrived at the other end. And it was not until they reached safety that Bill felt Jimmy's presence leave him. Even though Bill was now an experienced flyer, he realized he could never have steered the plane through the canal in a straight line as he had just done without the help of a powerful force, because even the most experienced pilot could not have flown the plane in such violent stormy conditions, as it would have been buffeted around. But as long as his brother remained in control, the plane's compass did not waver at all, and the plane remained absolutely straight throughout the ordeal. However, after surviving that ordeal, they were still not out of danger, as their fuel was now critically low and visibility was non-existent, and they were still uncertain where they could safely land. Bill again relied on instinct and his brother when he somehow knew when to turn, and as he did, the lights of Athens miraculously appeared to him. As the plane touched safely down, the port engine immediately ran out of fuel, just as the plane taxied to a halt. It had somehow timed itself perfectly to the last drop of fuel. When the story of their miracle flight reached the Greek authorities, they were told that their flight through the canal, as they had claimed, could not possibly have taken place because the walls of the canal were barely wider than the wingtips of the plane, and even if the weather conditions were perfect, the flight would have been an impossibility, and in a severe storm, it was definitely not possible. When Bill later checked on the canal's width compared to the plane's wingspan, he too knew that he could not have flown the plane through that small clearance. But that was because he hadn't, his brother Jimmy had. If you're enjoying this video, don't forget to hit like It really helps to keep the channel growing. And if you're new here, subscribe and tap the bell icon so you never miss our latest videos. We've got lots of strange and fascinating stories coming up, and we'd love to have you along for the journey. The following haunting is considered to be one of the most famous ghost stories during World War I, where there were so many credible witnesses that it was even investigated by the British government. Lieutenant Desmond Lucius Studdert P.P. Arthur was born on the 31st of March 1884 at O'Brien's Bridge in County Clare, Ireland, and came from a prominent County Clare family. Arthur was educated at Pretoria Royal School in Enniskillen in Northern Ireland. From a young age, he had an adventurous spirit, and as he got older, he loved fast cars, where he won a number of prizes in speed trials. In 1908, he became a lieutenant in the Army Motor Reserve. However, Arthur was not only interested in vehicles on the ground, but also took a keen interest in flying, which at that time was in its infancy. His enthusiasm was such that he attended the very first Irish aviation meeting at Leopardstown Racecourse in Dublin on the 29th of August 1910. It was at that meeting that he met a man called Cecil Grace, aged 30, who was a pioneer aviator. It was meeting Cecil Grace that inspired Arthur to become a pilot. Unfortunately, just 4 months after that meeting, Cecil Grace went missing on a flight across the English Channel on the 22nd of December 1910. From that moment, things moved extremely fast for Arthur, where on the 27th of May 1911, he joined the 5th Battalion Royal Munster Fusiliers Special Reserve and was promoted to lieutenant. It was there that Arthur became known for his adventurous nature, modest manner and high spirits. Barely a year later, on the 18th of June 1912, he gained his Royal Aero Club certificate after successfully completing his trials flying a Bristol Priya monoplane at Brooklands Aerodrome in Surrey, UK. On the 17th of April 1913, he joined the No. 2 Squadron of the Royal Flying Corps. The squadron was based at Montrose Airfield in Scotland and was the operational base for the training of pilots for the Royal Flying Corps and was the first of its kind in the UK. Like many training schools, there were frequent crashes, but it was here that pilots were trained for both World War I and World War II. On Tuesday the 27th of May 1913 at around 7:30 a.m, Lieutenant Arthur took to the air in a BE-2-205 biplane, but disaster struck when it collapsed without warning while flying over Montrose while undertaking a routine practice flight from Upper Dysart to Lunnon Bay. While Arthur had started his descent, suddenly, at 2,500 feet, the right wing of the aircraft snapped off and it plunged to the ground, taking the life of the young lieutenant. He was thrown from the aircraft and died instantly, breaking nearly every bone in his body, and was found 160 yards away from the machine. His fellow airmen were surprised by the crash, as they considered him to be a capable pilot. On the 21st of June 1913, the Accidents and Investigation Committee of the Royal Aero Club reported that the accident had been caused by a faulty repair of a broken spar by an unknown mechanic, and that damage to the aircraft had been caused by shoddy workmanship. It is in this location that our ghost story begins. It was a few months after Lieutenant Arthur's tragic accident on the 1st of January 1914 when the squadron moved from Upper Dysart to Broomfield Farm, and a Major Cyril Foggin saw a ghostly figure enter the officers' mess. However, he did not report it, firm that his reputation would be damaged and that he could be demoted or worse, be forced out of the services. But he was not the only person to witness ghostly apparitions, as there were further sightings by other officers and flight instructors. It appeared that all of the sightings were coming from the old mess of the No. 2 Flying Squadron. The sightings had become so frequent that the area became known as the Irish Apparition or the Montrose Ghost. Judging by the many descriptions given of the ghost, there appeared to be no doubt that they were seeing Lieutenant Arthur's apparition. His entity had become so common that guards were starting to desert their posts, and pilots were so spooked that they were requesting transfers out of Montrose. Other men began reporting mysterious footsteps and phantom plane noises. One pilot claimed he saw a fellow soldier in flight gear walk to the door of their mess hall, only to disappear without entering, while a flight instructor said he woke up in the middle of the night and saw a pilot sitting in a chair by his bed. Another man, who had known Arthur, said that Arthur appeared to his room and tried to speak to him, but that the entity couldn't make any sound. The stories became so infamous that supposedly a German pilot who was shot down and captured behind Allied lines asked what the latest news on the ghost was. Because of these sightings, superstitious pilots started thinking there was something keeping Arthur from moving on. A close friend of Lieutenant Arthur was C.C. Gray, who claimed that his appearance was linked to the official investigation into the crash. During World War I, another investigative report was published at the end of 1916 that totally exonerated Lieutenant Arthur and restored his reputation, finding that the crash was due to a damaged wing. This was the original unofficial diagnosis. After the findings, Arthur made another appearance on the 17th of January 1917, which many believed would be his last haunting, that his spirit could at last move on, knowing that it had been vindicated. However, that was not to be, when he made another appearance 23 years later in 1940 when Britain was involved in World War II. A Hurricane pilot claimed that he was distracted by a mysterious World War I biplane while searching for a German Heinkel bomber. Whether this plane was an omen in some way is not known, or maybe Lieutenant Arthur felt that making an appearance would help the pilot's morale. In 1942, a flight lieutenant stationed at Montrose crashed into the runway not long after takeoff and lost his life immediately. Apparently, a week before the crash, he'd been seen quarrelling with a mechanic who had been working on his plane. The mechanic then became the subject of an inquiry in the belief he may have tampered with the plane, causing it to crash. But no evidence was found, although it was mentioned that shortly after the crash there were reports of a ghost appearing at the airfield wearing a flying suit and goggles. In a classic ghostly scene, the pilot was described as walking along the flight line emerging from a fog. Did Lieutenant Arthur make an appearance to guide the deceased pilot? By 1949, Montrose was now a permanent training station with a constant stream of new recruits who were all duly warned about the ghost. Lieutenant Arthur never failed to disappoint, in that there were dozens of sightings of an officer in a white flight suit with a hat and goggles. The sightings continued until the airfield closed in the 1950s. Then, on the 27th of May 1963, Sir Peter Masefield was flying his Chipmunk monoplane close to the old Montrose Air Base when he spotted an old BE-2 biplane. He described the pilot as wearing a leather flying helmet with goggles and a flying scarf, not in any way believing he was seeing an apparition. He watched in shock as the plane crashed. Masefield then landed his plane expecting to find the wreckage, but found no sign of a plane or its wreckage. Lieutenant Arthur's fatal air crash was one of the first to occur in the Royal Flying Corps and the first at Montrose. He was buried in Sleepy Hillock Cemetery, Montrose. Lieutenant Arthur was honoured with a wreathland ceremony on the 100th anniversary of his deadly accident. Whether that was the last people would see of his ghost is another thing altogether. On August 16, 1942, there were two airmen whose task was to patrol the coast and search for Japanese submarines, then return to base. This was the last time the airmen were seen or heard from. Their airship or blimp was an L-8, which was part of the Airship Patrol Squadron 32. The airship was built in 1941 and commissioned on March 5, 1942. The airship had in its arsenal 30 caliber machine gun, 300 rounds of ammunition, and two 325-pound Mark 17 det bombs mounted on an external rack. The airships were able to hover in place and would lower devices for surveillance in order to combat enemy submarines. The disappearances of the two crew members from the blimp in front of thousands of people still has no explanations. The missing airmen were Ensign Charles Adams and Lieutenant Ernest Cody. Both pilots were professionals and had extensive flight experience. Ensign Adams was 38 years old and had served in the USS Akron, the USS Macon, and the USS Los Angeles. Lieutenant Ernest Cody was a graduate of the Academy of the Navy, whose mother-in-law stated that her son-in-law was a calm and balanced man. The Navy base was situated at Moffett Field in California and had an airfield on Treasure Island in San Francisco Bay. From there, blimps rose up to patrol the coast and search for Japanese submarines. One of these blimps was the L-8, which was part of the Airship Patrol Squadron 32. When the airship was ready for launching, they found wet fog had settled on the soft surface of the blimp, significantly weighing it down. Due to this extra weight, the mechanic was forced to stay on the ground, resulting in the blimp's crew size being reduced to just 2 people. When the problems were sorted, the airship was finally able to take off at 6:03 a.m. As the airship traversed the ocean below, at 7:44 a.m, Cody reported that a suspicious stain was found on the water near the Farallon Islands and announced that he was going to investigate a suspicious oil slick. Stand by. An oil spill could indicate signs that an enemy submarine could be present. The airship dropped 2 Mark IV float lights and began to explore the area. The blimp circled the area of the slick for an hour. The drama was witnessed by sailors from the fishing trawler Daisy Gray and the ship Albert Gallatin, who later verified that the airmen had dropped smoke flares. On viewing this, the crew of the Albert Gallatin sounded the alarm and prepared weapons. The airmen continued to circle the slick at an altitude of 200 to 300 feet, which was witnessed by the first mate of the trawler, who was close enough to the gondola to describe in detail the 2 pilots. At 9 a.m, the pilots threw off the ballast, rose and headed back towards San Francisco. The movements of their airship did not arouse any suspicion because the coast of California was regularly patrolled by blimps. Throughout the whole saga, air traffic controllers at Moffett Field had been keeping regular communications between the base and the airship, but at around 8:30 a.m, before the pilots had thrown off the ballast at 9 a.m, things had gone eerily quiet, and there was now radio silence. When the blimp was still silent at 8:50 a.m, 2 Kingfisher float planes were sent out to find it, as well as other aircraft in the area that had received warnings to report on a Navy blimp. At 10:49 a.m, the pilot of a Pan American airplane on its approach to San Francisco had noticed the blimps over the Golden Gate Bridge. A short time later, 2 more aircraft confirmed that they had seen the airship, and everything looked in order. At 11 a.m, the blimp was seen soaring up at a sharp angle and disappeared into the clouds at an altitude of about 2,000 feet. This height was getting dangerously close to its limit, at which point its valves would open to release helium in order to prevent an explosion. Why were these experienced pilots now behaving in a risky and careless manner? At 11:20 a.m, the airship was spotted over the coastal highway. The airship was also seen by an on-duty seaman called Richard Quam, who took a photograph of the blimp. He said the engines were not working, the gondola was empty, and the shell would have filled with helium, causing it to partially blow off, resulting in the airship declining due to loss of gas. As the airship was now getting closer to the ground, 2 swimmers attempted to grab the hanger ropes to try and stop the blimp, but found it was too heavy. A short time later, the blimp hit a golf course, resulting in it losing one of the depth charges. Fortunately, depth charges only explode under the pressure of water. Unfortunately, this only resulted in the blimp taking off again, and finally coming to rest in Daly City, a suburb of San Francisco, where it damaged a car and houses. The outer skin of the blimp was tangled in wires, and the gondola was almost standing upright. Without waiting for the authorities, the locals rushed to open the door of the gondola, hoping to rescue the men inside, only to find it empty. When the firemen arrived, they slashed at the envelope with axes, believing that they were trapped inside. Again, it was empty. When the military finally arrived on inspection, they discovered that there was a lot of fuel still in the tanks. They also located 3 parachutes, a single life raft, a machine gun, the pilot's personal weapons, a loudspeaker, and a walkie-talkie. Everything seemed to be in place. One of the gondola doors was locked, and the second was closed, but not locked. After an official inquiry, they found that the motors were still in working order. The control buttons were in the on position, although the motors would not have been working as it drifted above the ground. The radio was also working, but even if it had failed, the crew could have requested assistance from any vessel using the loudspeaker. The pilots could have parachuted to safety, but they were still intact in the gondola. The only thing missing was smoke bombs and life jackets, which the pilots would have been wearing. The commission into their disappearance suggested that the crew had accidentally fallen out of the open door, but if that was the case, how is it that both doors were closed? In addition, the military unsuccessfully searched the strip of land and the area of the bay over which the airship had drifted. Any bodies should have remained afloat, since the vests the pilots wore inflated automatically upon contact with water. They then started to come out with wild theories of them having an argument, with one fatally assaulting the other, throwing him out of the cabin and then escaping. Maybe they were shot by a Japanese sniper, but the wild accusations were all rejected. A witness and telephone operator called Ida Ruby came forward, stating that when she was sitting on the beach, she witnessed the blimp drifting up from the ocean and swore that she'd seen 3 people on board. Then 17-year-old Edward Taylor, using binoculars, also witnessed people moving about in the cabin. Maybe this third man fatally assaulted the pilots and threw their bodies overboard. But experts claim that this was not possible, as there was no place in the gondola where a third person could hide. Besides, the pictures that were taken while it drifted showed that the cabin looked empty. Thousands of people, and even the police, had witnessed the airship drifting across the skies, and all claimed that the cabin was empty, and would have seen their bright life jackets falling from the gondola. The investigators made the conclusions and said that the sudden rise of an airship at 11 a.m. could only be caused by weight loss, such as the men falling out, and not by releasing excess helium from the envelope. Why did the pilot stop broadcasting if the radio worked? Why were the motors dead, even though the buttons were turned on? After the commission came up with no suitable theories as to what happened to the pilots, there were many other wild theories, such as that they were captured by a Japanese submarine. They were spying for Japan and escaped. A third person had managed to get on board, fatally assaulting them and fleeing. One of the pilots took the other's life over a woman, and while disposing of the body, lost his own life. 1 year after the incident, they were officially declared missing. Experts believe that their bodies will never be found, and they will probably never discover the truth of what happened. The airship itself did not sustain any serious damage and returned to service as a training blimp. After the war, it was returned to the company that built it.
In the year 1861, Bar Lassiter, a young man of 22, lived with his parents and an elder sister near Carthage, Tennessee. The family were in somewhat humble circumstances, subsisting by cultivation of a small and not very fertile plantation. They were not rated as among the so-called best people of their neighbourhood, but they were honest persons of good education, well-mannered, and as respectable as any family could be. The elder Lassiter had a severity of manner, but also an uncompromising devotion to duty and warm and affectionate disposition. As a result, the family home, while kindly, was also a veritable citadel of duty. When the war came on, it found in the family, as in so many others, a divided sentiment. The young man was loyal to the Union, the others savagely hostile. This unhappy division created domestic bitterness, and when Bar Lassiter left home with the avowed purpose of joining the Federal Army, not a word of farewell or good wishes followed him out into the world. Making his way to Nashville, he enlisted in the first organization he found, a Kentucky regiment of cavalry. In due time, he passed through all the stages of military evolution, from raw recruit to experienced trooper. His surviving comrades later described him as a right good trooper. 2 years after Bar had joined it, his regiment passed through the region from whence he had come, where the country had suffered severely from the ravages of war. The region had been occupied alternately and simultaneously by the belligerent forces, and a sanguinary struggle had occurred in the immediate vicinity of the Lassiter homestead. But of this the young trooper was not aware. Finding himself in camp near his home, he felt a natural longing to see his parents and sister. Hoping in them, as in him, the natural animosities of the period had been softened by time and separation. Obtaining a leave of absence, he set foot in the late summer afternoon, and soon after the rising of the full moon was walking up the gravel path leading to the dwelling in which he had been born. Soldiers in war age rapidly, and by now Bar Lassiter felt himself an old man. He had almost expected to find the place a ruin and desolation, but nothing apparently was changed. At the sight of each dear and familiar object, he was profoundly affected, his heart beating audibly. His emotions suffocated him, an ache in his throat as he unconsciously quickened his pace until he almost ran. The house was unlit, the door open. As Bar approached and paused to recover himself, his father came out and stood bareheaded in the moonlight. "Father," cried the young man, springing forward with outstretched hand. "Father!" The elder man looked him sternly in the face, stood a moment motionless, and, without a word, withdrew into the house. Bitterly disappointed, humiliated, inexpressibly hurt, and altogether unnerved, the soldier dropped upon a rustic seat in deep dejection, supporting his head upon his trembling hand. But he was too good a soldier to accept repulse as defeat. He rose and entered the house, passing directly to the sitting room. In the dim lighting, on a low stool by the hearthside, the only article of furniture in the place, sat his mother. She stared into a fireplace. Bar spoke to her tenderly, with concern and hesitation, but she neither answered nor moved, nor seemed in any way surprised. True, there had been time for her husband to inform her of their guilty son's return. He moved nearer and was about to lay his hand on her arm when his sister entered from an adjoining room, looked him full in the face, and passed him without a sign of recognition. She left the room by a door that was partly behind him, and he turned his head to watch her. When she had gone, his eyes again sought his mother. She too had left the place. Bar Lassiter strode to the door by which he had entered. Through his tears, the moonlight on the lawn created a rippling sea, the surrounding trees and their black shadows shaking as in a breeze. Even the gravel walk seemed unsteady and insecure to step on. Bar felt his tears on his cheek and saw them sparkle on the breast of his trooper's jacket. He left the house and made his way back to camp. The next day, with no very definite intention and confused feelings, he again sought the spot. Within half a mile of it, he met Bushrod Albro, a former playfellow and schoolmate, who greeted him warmly. Bar told him that he was going to visit his home. His friend looked at him rather sharply, but said nothing. "I know," said the soldier, "that my folks have not changed, but—" Albro interrupted him to say that there had been changes, and offered to accompany him. He said that they could talk on the way, but Albro did not talk. Instead of a house, the two men found only fire-blackened foundations of stone, enclosing an area of compacted ashes pitted by rains. Bar's astonishment was extreme. Albro quietly said that he could not find the right way to tell his friend that, in the fight a year ago, his house had been burned by a federal shell. Bar desperately asked about his family. Where were they? Albro answered, "In heaven, I hope. All were killed by the shell."
Throughout history, there have been thousands of battles that have taken place in the many wars that humans have fought over the centuries. Every gruesome battle has left behind scars and strong emotional imprints that are forever etched into the landscape. The following story is typical of vicious bloody war and the many battles that were fought between the Union and the Confederate armies, leaving behind death, destruction, and the ghosts of war that have been witnessed by the many visitors who attended the battlegrounds. Cold Harbor Battlefield in Hanover County, Virginia, was one of the bloodiest battles, not only in the American Civil War, but in American history. Cold Harbor battlefield was the site of Commanding General of the United States Army Union leader Lieutenant General Ulysses S. Grant's overland campaign from May the 31st to June the 12th, 1864. On June the 2nd, 1864, both armies constructed a complex series of barricades that stretched 7 miles, and in the early morning of June the 3rd, 3 Union corps attacked the Confederate fortifications, resulting in heavy losses on both sides. When it ended, 1,845 Union soldiers had lost their lives, and 9,077 were wounded, and 1,816 were either captured or went missing. In the Confederate Army, 788 soldiers had lost their lives, 3,376 were wounded, and 1,213 were either captured or reported missing. General Grant later admitted that he regretted the last assault at Cold Harbor because no advantage was ever made considering the number of casualties. It was a loss that would haunt Grant for the rest of his life. With so much loss of life and destruction, it is no wonder that a strong emotional imprint would be left of both genuine ghostly apparitions as well as residual hauntings, which is energy left behind after a traumatic event such as a large battle. Visitors to the site of the battlefield report seeing apparitions of soldiers from both north and south wandering the grounds, whilst others have seen soldiers fighting as if still in battle. Others have heard the calls from commanders leading their men into battle. At night, some locals have spotted ghostly orbs floating around, while others have reported hearing the sounds of horses' hooves along Route 156 and claim to have smelt gunpowder or heard the sounds of artillery fire and the shouts and cries of men. All of these apparitions and sounds witnessed by people from a battle that had taken place more than 150 years previously. At the time of the Civil War, Miles and Margaret Garthright lived in a 2-story home a few miles east of Richmond, Virginia, and their property was in a dangerous location as it was on the battlefield of the 2 major battles during the 2 campaigns. The Union Army turned the building into a field hospital, forcing the Garthright family into the basement. Blood from the wounded would drip through the floorboards and into the basement. Some 97 Union soldiers had passed there and had to be unceremoniously buried in the Garthrights' yard. It's said that a little girl thought to be the daughter of the local gravedigger lost her life when she fell from one of the windows during the heat of battle in the surrounding fields. Witnesses claim to have seen the ghost of the little girl wearing a white dress and bonnet wandering through the fields and graveyards that ran alongside the battlefield. Others claim to have seen her peering at them from the windows of the Garthright house. Author and paranormal investigator Beth Brown visited the park when the ghostly activity was most prominent, which was between 1 a.m. and 2 a.m. Brown was accompanied by other fellow investigators, where the team included 9 believers and skeptics. Law enforcement officer Barry Krieg, who was a total skeptic from the park services, also accompanied them, and as the night rolled on, Barry Krieg would change his tune. They headed into the darkness equipped with cameras, night vision video equipment, EMF detectors, and digital audio recorders. As they were proceeding, the group could hear the sounds of someone following them along the pathway, but every time they turned and looked back, using their night vision equipment, expecting to see some kind of nocturnal creature like a deer, there was nothing to be seen. Some of the group could smell the sugary sweet odour of sassafras, and then watched as a thick fog settled over the field where the battle had taken place, like remnants of thick gun smoke. During the night they had taken many photographs and later sorted through them, where they discovered several photographs that included light anomalies, which they intended to use as evidence. The rangers were quite surprised at the number of unexplainable photographs that were taken that actually challenged their skepticism, and after many years of doubting that such things existed, would later talk openly about the unusual activity they'd encountered. They commented that maybe there was some truth to all of the stories. Beth Brown wrote a book about her experience titled Haunted Battlefields, Virginia's Civil War Ghosts. The following story is about a family who visited the location of where the Normandy landings took place, or, as it is better known, as the D-Day landings. Whilst visiting the sites, their daughter was observing more than just the bunkers and other remnants of the war. She could see things that her parents could not, and it was not until a year later that she shocked her parents by describing World War II German soldiers ready for battle, more than 60 years after the event. Ghosts of Normandy. The following incident took place in 2007, when a couple and their daughter were visiting Normandy in the northern coast of France, and more specifically the site of the Normandy landings, which took place in June 1944 during World War II. The first stop was at Pegasus Bridge, and they then moved into the beaches and bunkers of Normandy and then onto Saint-Mère-Église. The first German bunkers I actually came upon was Pointe du Hoc, which had not changed in over 60 years when the bunkers were overrun by the US Army Rangers on D-Day. They visited many bunkers and escape tunnels where most bunkers were totally dark, and the only light was when the father had taken the occasional flash with their camera, which temporarily lit up the dark chambers. In all, they not only viewed many bunkers, but many other ruins that had been destroyed in the ensuing battle. At the time of their visit, the daughter was 7 years old, with no knowledge of World War II, let alone who the armies were that were fighting each other, what types of uniforms they wore, or types of weapons they used. At their home back in the United States, there were no war books with pictures, and she had never been exposed to any war movies or ever seen her father playing war games on his PC, as they ensured she was not in the room when he played them. Therefore, their daughter had had no previous exposures to anything relating to World War II. About a year after their visit to Normandy, and their daughter was now 8 years of age, she started to talk about strange things that she had observed whilst they were touring the Normandy battlefields. She said she saw men looking at her and pointing guns at her and following her while they were in the bunkers and around the Normandy area. She claimed that they were crouching down, hiding behind corners, holding guns and looking as if they were very angry. Her father became so intrigued by her story that he decided to delve a little further into what she claimed she had witnessed. Her father claims he was not into the paranormal. In fact, he was a complete skeptic and would normally debunk any such story if anyone were to tell him about such things. However, he was so fascinated with his daughter's story that he decided to keep an open mind and ask her a series of questions. He asked her what they looked like, and she said they were mad and their clothes were grey in colour and their helmets were even darker. He asked whether there were a lot of them, and she said yes, and they were hiding behind trees, in the bunkers, in all the corners and behind the walls. They were crouched down, and some were kneeling. He then asked her, did they have nice uniforms and were they loose? She said the uniforms were nice, with lots of buttons in the front and things on their shoulders. He asked whether they wore any medals, either on the head or chest, and she said yes, something like a circle with a star in it on the chest. Were you scared? He asked her. Yes, but I knew they weren't trying to hurt me, so I didn't think anything of it. But there were a lot of them, everywhere I looked. They were moving around and crawling, but bent over. When we walked out of the bunker, I could see one in the grass and behind a tree. Then, when I was in the car, I could see them looking at me from behind a fence in a field. Sometimes a lot of them, sometimes only one or two. Her father then said, why didn't you say something to me? And she replied, well, I couldn't. I didn't know what they were. I knew they weren't real, so you wouldn't believe me anyway. He asked, were there different types? And she replied, yes, some had different colours, like a dark colour, and then a greenish colour. He asked her to draw some of the things she'd seen. What she drew scared the hell out of her father. He asked her about the gun the soldier was carrying, where she proceeded to draw what resembled an MP-40, of which the German soldiers actually used in World War II. She tried drawing the helmet, but she couldn't get it right. Her father then drew the front view of a standard German helmet. She said that was it. It was pointy on the sides when you looked straight at it. He then asked her about their boots, but she was unable to describe them as they were not standing up. This was true, as most German combat poses were crouching down. He asked her to describe what other soldiers were wearing, and she drew a German tunic. She said it was tight and looked very nice. It was not baggy and had buttons. When she drew a picture, she quickly drew the medals on the right breast, and also correctly described the colours and shapes that would have been the unmistakable camouflage pattern. There was one particular soldier she was describing that looked different from the others, and he was in the bushes. He had a very dark helmet, a really big gun, bigger than the others, and his clothes were funny colours, like something green and dark colour, with different shapes, where she was again describing the camouflage design. They later went to the library to further research what she described and found a World War II book with many pictorial images. He showed her pictures of British, American and German soldiers, and she quickly pointed out the German soldiers, saying, "That's the helmet, that's the jacket, and that's the gun." He then showed her a colour drawing of an MP40, along with other World War II weapons, on the same page. She immediately picked them out on that page. They returned home and went on the internet, where they found a picture of a 12-inch doll of a Fallschirmjäger. The Fallschirmjäger were the paratrooper branch of the German Luftwaffe during World War II. They were the first German paratroopers to be committed in large-scale airborne operations and were used at Normandy. She had described the man with his dark helmet and chin strap that was easy to see and wrapped around under the chin very tight. When she drew the picture of it, it looked different to the other helmets. She said it was not pointy on the sides, it was flat, small, and tight to his head. When her father showed her an actual picture of the soldier, she said, "That's what he looked like. That's the helmet, Daddy, and his jacket looks the same." She had also correctly described the medal, which was the unit designation badge that all German soldiers wore. She pointed out a circle with oak leaves when he showed her pictures of the unit badges. He was baffled as to how his daughter could describe in detail the German soldier's uniform from World War II, and could only have gotten the description from actual sightings, because she knew nothing about World War II, let alone the Normandy landings. There is no doubt that when they visited Normandy in 2007, she had seen ghosts or apparitions of German soldiers waiting for the Allied troops to land on the 6th of June 1944. The father says that what his daughter saw that day, she claimed, was 100% true.